Good morning and welcome to Morning Coffee with Brigid. I am Brigid Burke, and this is our little daily session. It's a bit foggy and actually a little bit, it's more damp and chilly out this morning. Good morning. Yeah, it's a bit damp out this morning. It's a bit damp and chilly. So, and probably as you can see from the lighting, it's a little grayer in here today. But yeah, we will persist. I've gotten up with a number of things on my mind today, and I did have my good morning my morning meditation and everything that I needed to do today. And the kind of thing that came up for me to particularly talk about today has to do with what is it? With the card that I had pulled, because I was always play around with this deck a little bit, was the Thunderbolt card. Okay, so that's the equivalent of the Tower. So the Tower has to do with Uranus energy. Okay, it's this energy of when something very, very suddenly comes in and it kind of it raises things to the ground. Things that maybe, structures that maybe we've built, or maybe routines or habit patterns that we're in. Something may happen and they may suddenly fall apart. Now that can manifest in a lot of different ways. It can manifest as obstacles that we hit. Like we could be doing stuff and then all of a sudden we just can't, the more that we try to do something, the more we just feel like, we hit resistance. It's kind of almost like days at work. When I used to go to a day job, it would be the kind of days where you were trying to get to work, you were in traffic, you were late, you got to work, and then you went to go turn on your computer, and then you found out like your system is down, and then next thing you know, the internet goes down, and then this happens, and after a while, you're just like, why did I even come in here today? And I don't know, it ends up kind of putting you on a different track. It's kind of like, again, not to belabor what happened 2 weeks ago, but, the idea, like when I had my power outage, like I had all these things I had planned for the next couple of days. I have a podcast that I do. I was like, okay, I've got a podcast to record. I had everything set up, my research, all this stuff. I was like, okay, I'm going to be all ready to go. And boom, there was no power. So I couldn't, I have a Mac, so everything I have is on the cloud. So in other words, if the power goes out, there's nothing saved locally to your computer. You have to, which really sucks. So I was like, okay, literally everything I thought, okay, well, I'll sit down and work on this. Well, wait, I can't work on that because I don't have, I don't have the electricity, or certain things I could have done on battery power, but then you had to worry that, okay, when we were out for 2 days, am I going to be able to go somewhere and get battery, enough that I need so that I'll have at least a phone available for phone calls if I need it. So yeah, it's just, there's something that happens when we have these moments that occur. And in this past week, I've talked to quite a lot of people who have been having these tower moments, or these kind of things that just come in very unexpectedly. The way I kind of couched it was, it's almost like we're not in Mercury retrograde, okay? In fact, Mercury is in Gemini, and this, of course, is a very good placement for it. I mean, Mercury rules Gemini, right? And then we've got this wonderful Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, and we're actually moving into a new moon tomorrow. Tomorrow's the new moon, so today's kind of a void course day, or at least it's the last day of the dark moon. So this is really a day of kind of like finishing things up, and then tomorrow is the new moon. And it happens to be in Jupiter. Well, it's on Thursday, which is Jupiter's day. So that's actually a very good thing for building new things, for building prosperity, and trying to set new intentions for that. But a lot of people have found, certainly in the energy in the wake of the eclipses, and then May, which was a much quieter month by comparison. We got out of Mercury retrograde post-shadow, I think around May 14th. And so now this should be really a smooth sailing kind of period of time with communication and everything. But what I'm finding is that it's not. A lot of people I'm talking to, there's been a lot of miscommunication. There's been a lot of, just situations that have been thrown into a lot of doubt and uncertainty. And I do know that Uranus has been active. In fact, there was a Uranus-Jupiter conjunction at the end of April and as well, which is actually not a bad thing. I mean, usually that's the idea that bringing unexpected good luck, unexpected surprises, right? Things like, the good stuff that happens unexpectedly. Because not everything unexpected, obviously, is bad. But we have this kind of energy that's going on here. But there's also been a lot of tearing down. And the thing that came to me this morning, and kind of as I was meditating and connecting and doing all that, was just that, a lot of times it's always the thing of, I'm going to put it this way. I'm going to say be careful what you wish for, but I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. What I mean by that is that sometimes we are focused on what we want. We have our goals. We say, okay, this is where I want to get to. I want to achieve, whatever things it is that you're trying to do. You want your business to be successful. You want, or if you're, let's just say, you're in a new relationship and you want it to be successful, or you're trying to meet somebody, or you're, whatever the thing is that you're doing. You have to remember that we kind of have an idea in our mind of how that should go. We always think like, oh, okay, well, it's going to take these 3 steps, and that's, or I'm just going to suddenly get a bunch of clients and I'm going to start making money this month, or I'm going to, whatever the thing is that we're trying to achieve, whatever we might be taking a risk for. And of course, when you're doing anything that's in a very practical nature, you're going to obviously have some kind of a plan about what you're going to do, about where, if business is not going well, where's the money going to come from? We have all these things that we have set up. And when all of those things kind of fall apart suddenly and fall away, the question then becomes, okay, well, what's going on here? Because typically when you have this influence that comes in and just creates chaos and just messes everything up, the point is not that you're having bad luck, you're cursed, and you have a terrible life. The point is that somehow you need to change direction. And often you'll find that it's like, whether you want to think of it as you, whether you want to think of it as the universe, as I've said, we're part of a system. It's not like we function in a vacuum. Okay, we are part of a system. We're not isolated. But as we are moving through that system, the system's going to move us where we want to go. We may be thinking we have to go that way, and they're like, nope, you're going that way. And that's why you have to have a sort of a sense of surrender to that, which is not very easy to do, because it means that you have to trust, and it means that you have to let go of the outcome. You have to say, I'm in this. I'm gonna go for this. Whatever the outcome is, or however this works. Because really, where the unexpected comes in, it's not necessarily saying, oh, you're not going to reach your goal, or you're not going to get to the place you want to get to, or you're not going to reach that place in life where you want to be. The problem is that you don't know how to get to the place you want to be. We think we know. We say, well, this is the way other people did it, and this is the way I need to do it, because, these 10 people who are successful say that this is the way you do it. And that's the way we do things, right? I mean, we try to learn from people who have experience and who have done it. And we say, that's how they did it good, so to speak. And so you think, oh, okay, well, that's what I have to do to be successful as well. But see, you're you, and your path is different, and your path may not be the same as theirs. In fact, almost guaranteed your path is not the same as theirs. That's why when I do my coaching, when I put things up about it, a lot of times, and I've seen coaches do this because I have worked with coaches in the past myself, as well as coaching people, I've been coached. And I have seen the way that they are. They'll come out, somebody will have a need, and they'll be like, right, here's our 5-step plan, or how we're going to get you from point A to point B. And my thing about that is always but that 5-step plan, I mean, it might be a good framework. It might be a good starting point. You can have some kind of a framework, but to suggest to people that this is going to get you exactly to where you want to be, not necessarily. It's not, because there may be certain circumstances, and the circumstances may not always just be, how much money you have, or where you live, or, factors like that, right? Or, if there's something involves travel, if you have other people like spouse or children involved, it's not necessarily about any of that. I mean, that could be part of the equation. but it's not. But ultimately, there's also, like I said, this is one of the reasons when I do coaching, why I do astrological charts, why I look at both the Vedic system and the Western system, because I feel like they may boil down in summary to a lot of the same information, but they really do highlight and focus different things in my view, or that at least some of them are better at highlighting certain things. And that's why I look at human design, and that's why I look at all this stuff, because I said you want to look at what you're doing. I mean, if you're somebody who's like, okay, right, my goal is to, I don't know, I want to be a CEO somewhere, and I'm going to do this. But then if I run your human design chart and it says, well, your type is a projector, and I'm going to be like, I mean, there's nothing to say you can't go for being the CEO of something if that's what you really want, but energetically, that may not be something you can maintain. And you have to take that into account, that it's going to be a bigger challenge for you if you're going to go down that road. Like, it's like knowing where you're at. But even knowing where you're at, I mean, you can change, and you do change, and you do transform. So that's the other piece of it, is that sometimes as we're going through changes, we may say, well, yeah, in the past, this is what I was, and, I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that. But, you have to also look at, like, that's why I look at transits too. What are the changes? What's going on? What's going on now that's different from what was going on before? We're seeing what's going on before. We're seeing kind of, what cards you were dealt, so to speak. I mean, maybe literally, but figuratively, in terms of looking at that information and saying, okay, what were your challenges? And good morning. What were your challenges, and what were the things that you came into this life having to deal with? And then that's why I go over that kind of stuff with people, and then they kind of say, oh yeah, I've always had this issue with my family, or I've always had this, or I've always had that, or yeah, my other friends, they seem to make money easily, but I don't. And like there's just different things. Or you may find that you have a long period of time where something is easy for you, and then it becomes hard all of a sudden. And so the question then becomes, when you have that thunderbolt moment, when the thing that you've done that you always relied upon suddenly just breaks down. And whether that be, like I said, whether that has to do with a job or career, whether that has to do with a personal situation, like a relationship maybe that you've been in for a long time and maybe it goes bust. Or maybe there's a family situation that blows up that you're involved in. Or like I said, there's a lot of different possibilities about what could go on there. But when you have a personal situation that blows up like that, then the question becomes, okay, one of the things it says is you need to kind of meet the process halfway. You don't want to, one thing we tend to do as a defense mechanism is we kind of put the barrier up, or we try to escape from it, for one. Which again, to a certain degree, if we really feel weighted down by something, a little time to escape is probably not a bad thing. I mean, it's not bad to just say, okay, I need a break from this. I need a night off. I need this. I need that. There's nothing wrong with doing that, because that's just part of kind of trying to calm yourself down. But that's more of an immediate, just kind of a short-term thing. You still have the long-term implications of what's going on to think about. And some of that is going to be about planning and sticking to a plan, okay? Again, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The other piece of it, though, is I think a lot of times when these things happen, it's making us question, what authentically do we want? Like, what direction are we going in? And it could be that all the steps that we are taking and we're saying, yes, this is going to get me to where I want to go. The universe could be saying, that's not going to take you to where you want to go. That's not the way you need to do it. So everything may get all messed up on you. And you may be feeling discouraged and despaired and say, well, see, now I can't do it. I failed. And you haven't. The only reason anything like a failure has come in is because it's trying to break down and restructure for what is the right way. And now you may, because then of course the next natural question, especially when I'm reading for people, I'll say, okay, this was not the way to go. They're like, okay, right. Then what is the way to go? Don't tell me the negatives. Tell me the positives. Tell me the opportunities. And the frustrating thing is sometimes there's not an immediate answer to that. Sometimes it's like, well, you need to explore different possibilities. or you need to think about different things. And people who kind of want to solve this right now are just kind of like, yeah, I don't really want to hear that. I want to know what to do now. And I'm that way too, quite frankly. I mean, I'm not holding myself up as some example of somebody who is somehow immune from all this, because I'm most definitely not. But yeah, so the question then but then we have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what, and also, yeah, what is the end game? What are we trying to get to? And the other piece of it, I think, is part of the questioning that we do there, or so part of the questioning I would do would be to say, okay, is that really where you want to go? Is this, if you are like somebody who, for example, I had a period, I'm just going to use myself as an example. I had a period of time when I was working in library, and I had moved up from, in the position I was in, I moved up from being the archivist, digital archivist, to being the department head of tech department head. And at one point there was an opening for university librarian, and I thought, right, I'm going to go for that because that seems the next logical step. I had been a library school professor. I had been, had worked in the field for over 20 years. It was like, yeah, I think I'm ready for this level of, and there were certain challenges that I felt I was qualified to take on. But of course that didn't happen, because even though I made it through like the first round of interviews with the committee, and I was being promoted as one of 3 people to the university provost, she said, "Oh no, I'm not hiring anybody in-house. I refuse." So, because there was an issue with somebody else in-house, and the thing is, I think there was a whole big thing of, oh well, if you hire somebody else over that person's going to try to do something legally or whatever it was. Nonetheless, that stopped that dead in its tracks. But as it turned out, in retrospect, that was the best thing that could have happened, because that was absolutely not the road I needed to be on. And then when I still was kind of persisting in really trying to pursue this kind of role that I had tried to take on, like taking on a lot of the burdens of different work that probably would have been better off leaving to somebody else, to be honest. Although, I would have been better off leaving it to somebody else. And then that's when my body started to break down, and that's when I started having panic attacks and things. And these things were happening because it was like a way of saying, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. Like, you need to, the gifts and the talents that you have and who you authentically are, who I authentically am. This is why I do this thing. When you think, gosh, the fact that I was doing library and I was doing systems and doing all this stuff, and now what am I doing? I'm coaching people. I'm doing tarot. It's like, and I mean, I'm also doing some other things too. I'm still like, I still have my foot in academia. I still do academic work. I still write papers. I still write books. I mean, so it's not, I mean, I'm basically doing all of the things that are creative and that make me feel alive. Okay. Those are all the things that I'm focused on. And I find that when I try to refocus on saying, but I just, and again, I'm not saying this is going to be true for everybody, okay? So true for Brigid does not necessarily mean true for you. So I just want to be clear on that. But my thing was just, trying to find a balance with things. And because like I said, recently I considered like, well, do I need to go back and get a full-time job? Do I need to, is this going to, but I keep kind of getting this thing of like, no, just trust that what you're doing is the right thing, and that you'll be provided for. And that's a really hard thing to do, because we, I think it was, oh God, I'm going to do an Alan Wattsism again. I'm really sorry. It was in The Wisdom of Insecurity. I remember that book, and he had said something about, rather than when you're born, he says, rather than people saying to you, welcome to life, we're so glad to have you here. It's like, right, you're on probation. Like, you're immediately born on probation. And everything you do is suspect, and every natural thing you do is going to be checked or put under a restriction of some kind, right? So we start very, very young. I remember Robert Bly had written a book called, what was it? The Little Book of the Human Shadow, or something to that effect. I can't remember if that's the exact title of it, but I read that in graduate school, and oh, good morning. I read that in graduate school, and it was basically, I remember the opening sections of the book. He talked about, he says, he referred to the shadow as the big bag that you drag around behind you that you start filling up from the time you're little. And so it's all the things, because you think about it, when you're a kid, you're very spontaneous, you're creative, you like to play. You're in a different creative and imaginative space than you are once you've gone to school and you've learned all the stuff and you've become rational and analytical and logical. Once sounding a little like that Supertramp song, right? But once you've learned how to do all that stuff, then that changes the way you look at the world, because obviously, there's the childish way of looking at the world. But the unfortunate thing about that is that we then lose our sense of spontaneity. You lose your sense of, because children have a real sense of wonder about the world. They're able to look at it with like fresh eyes. Even if you figure in karmas and all other kinds of stuff, and then of course, there are some children who are in situations that are very adult situations from very young ages. I mean, that can happen to people too, which is unfortunate, but it is a fact. And so the question is, we lose that ability to see with fresh eyes, because as much as our experience and our analysis and our rationality helps us, it can also hinder us in some way. We're not able to get back to that way of thinking, that ability to see things with fresh eyes, that ability to problem solve creatively in ways that we might think, well, that's silly or that's irrational, or that level of trust that inevitably we all, I refer to it, if I put on my religion scholar hat, we refer to it as the process of demythologization, okay? The fancy way of saying whatever you believed in literally as a child, eventually you come to realize may not be literally real. I mean, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a reality, by the way. There may be a reality to some things, but it may be more psychological or metaphorical than literal. Or, you never know, maybe it's literal too. And people just tell you it's not. But there's this idea that things that are, Santa Claus was always the example that was used in the classes that I took. It was like, okay, when you're a little kid, like, you might literally believe in Santa Claus, and then you get to a certain age, and at some point you realize, oh no, it's actually mom and dad or whoever is standing in to do the Santa Claus thing, right? Or the Father Christmas thing, or whatever. And as my professor had pointed out at the time, he says, okay, so the fact that Santa isn't, really a real being who comes from the North Pole or whatever, I mean, they let kids maintain the fantasy, right? NORAD does its Santa tracker every year, and, things like that. There's a thing about being able to be in that space and being able to enjoy that literal belief about things. But as I was going to say, as my professor had pointed out, he said, the fact that isn't real, I mean, okay, that might be like a little bit of a disillusionment. There's that demythologization that goes on. It's not about, okay, so that, not literally a person. Santa's not literally a person. But does that mean now that Christmas has no meaning? Does that mean now that, forget about it, all of this was just a waste of my time? Well, no. I mean, because now as you get older, the meaning of it changes. It's not a literal meaning, but it still has a meaning. Like, if you happen to be somebody who's religious, then Christmas is going to have a certain meaning for you. And, if you're a pagan, Christmas, Io Saturnalia, I guess, whatever it is you're celebrating at the winter solstice at that time of year, that's what's meaningful to you. And that's going to change as you get older, and your associations with it and everything else. But it doesn't all of a sudden mean like, oh, okay, all of it's invalid and doesn't mean anything. So we change over time, and but in that process, as part of that process, sometimes we have to go back and re-examine what we looked at before. Because another example of demythologization might be, like I said, if you grew up in a very religious household and you very literally believed, your parents told you, well, God does this and God says this and that, and then you have an experience. A lot of times what happens, especially in monotheistic religion, is that you will have, let's just say you go through life and let's just say you have like a sick family member that you love, okay? Like, let's just say, grandma is sick, and, you pray to God and say, God, take care of grandma and don't let her die, but then grandma dies, because everybody dies. It's not because of anything terrible, not because God hates you, but because that just happens. But then the child, kind of looking at it in a different way, might say, well, God didn't answer my prayer, so I don't know, now I'm questioning God. And that's a very normal thing to do. You question these things because that literalism, there's a certain natural literalism, as they call it, that eventually has to be transmuted into the experience of the world as we're in it. Now, does that mean, well, that means God is not real? Screw it, I mean, again, whether God's real or not it's a big question, right? If you believe in God, or you've had that, or if you've had the experience, then you don't, then that's not a question for you. But for some people it is. Obviously, there's atheistic people and so forth who don't believe, and or just don't necessarily, like with me, I don't believe necessarily in the monotheistic way. Not that I don't believe that there isn't something bigger than myself. But nonetheless, but your beliefs will change. And so let's just say you have somebody who gets to the teenage years and says, well, that's it, like a lot of bad things happen. So they decide, well, see, that means God's not here. And, but what then about conservative practitioners who are okay, that letter of the law with the scripture, that is what my instructor would have called, and that actually was his point. They call it forced literalism. And forced literalism, if we want to give an analogy, is when you believe like you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and you still believe Santa Claus is real, okay? You still believe Santa Claus is real. And in spite of the fact that everything around you tells you that that's not what any of this means at this point. And then you just get very angry, and then when Christmas comes, you just lock yourself in a room because you put your hand over your ears and go, I don't want to hear that it's not real. Because it's like Linus with the Great Pumpkin. If you watch that, it's just every year the Great Pumpkin never shows up, but he's just like, I believe in the Great Pumpkin. I just did something wrong this year. I wasn't sincere. I didn't find a sincere enough pumpkin patch. It's that kind of a thing. And yes, and the reason that people will do that, the reason that people cling to scriptures, okay, the reason that they is precisely because of what I'm talking about with this breakdown. When things break down, people, if you're looking at things in a very strictly good and evil structure, okay, then if bad things happen, that's evil, okay? And therefore, people become very, very scared and say, well, I have to make sure I'm on the side of the good and doing all the good things so bad things don't happen to me. But that's not how it works. It's not, I mean, even if you are a religious person, and I'm not suggesting that this means religion is false and that people shouldn't believe or anything like that. It's just that, as I've explained to my students, I'm like, you can believe in the creation myth, but it's not a literal myth. It's just telling you something metaphorically about time. We live in a world that's not unified. We live in separation. It tries to sort of couch the separation as a kind of disobedience, but fear-mongering and control. Well, that's it, because some people, they go through life wanting to have an answer. In other words, just like what I was saying before, I need the 5 steps to know how this is going to work. And people do kind of want that. They want something simplified. Fundamentalism, the word fundamentalism literally comes from fundamentals, meaning the simplest, the most basic, back to basics, right? And so the idea is just, nope, we just take it at face value and we don't read anything into it. And it's like, yeah, but you're reading something into it. And it's not actually meant that way. I've talked about when the Bible was translated for the first time by Martin Luther and into the Vulgate, and then he said, well, we're doing this because the Bible it's its own authority and it's clear and understandable, and anybody who's literate can read it for themselves, right? But as somebody pointed out, Luther had to write like a 25-page, and mind you, this is the old style books, like the Gutenberg Bibles, like the first one in the old printing presses, like the original ones. He had to write a 25-page introduction explaining everything in the Bible. I'm like, well, then it's not really that transparent, And it's really not meant to be. It's like it's something written. The Old Testament may be historical from a Judaic perspective, but you have to remember, as I explained to people, history is not written as like, now we think of history as like, oh, okay, we're going to record the facts of everything. That's not what they did ever, like in the past. History is just, it's either your mythos, your stories that are told, because remember, people used to have bards who would tell the stories and the exploits of their heroes, and that was their ancestry. That's their history. That's kind of what this is. And it's like our exploits, side by side, our God. Because remember, Yahweh was originally the Israelites' God, not everybody's God. That was a later development. So it's like, yeah, this is us and our God, and this is like, oh no, our God didn't help us here. Okay, what do we do wrong? Let's fix it. That's literally what the Old Testament is to me. It's just like, okay, how do we need to adjust the rules? Oh, maybe we did too much of what our neighbors did. Let's not do that. Let's do this. And you have to remember that that's the context of it. When people try to take that stuff and say, oh, well, that's what God wants me to do now, it's like, well, you're not you're not. That's why you have people who do what they call hermeneutics or am I saying the word right? Exegesis, where they take the where they look at the text very, very minutely. But really, like, the point of view I've taken over the years is it's not like, the text. There should be an inspiration in there for you if you follow that text. But if you read that text literally, you're missing the point of it. You're reading it, as Joseph Campbell would say, you're reading it as prose rather than as poetry. And because it's a matter of just like I said, you walk into a church and you see all these symbols, which of course Protestants don't like that. But if you walk in and you have all of the beautiful, like if you walk into a cathedral with the beautiful flying buttresses and the stained glass windows and the beautiful statuary and everything, the idea is not that those things are your gods, which is what the mistake is often made. It's like, no, those things are pointing you to something. And again, another Alan Wattsism, he says a lot of times, instead of following the finger that points the way, people suck on it for comfort. And that's the problem. The point is not that, the literal thing, that you need to fetishize the literal thing. Or as we would say, idolatry versus iconography. Idolatry is when you fetishize the thing. Iconography means it's something that inspires you to those things that wake you up to the bigger picture. Because the word religion is from religare, which is to tie back. So it's the idea of you're originally split. This is tying you back to the bigger picture. This is tying you back to the bigger field of where you are. That's what it's supposed to do. But a lot of times it ends up becoming a tool that people use to kind of separate themselves out. And that's why, and then they become very conflicted, and then it becomes a thing of like, this is where you start seeing apologetics and missionary work where it's like, well, everybody has to believe what I believe because there's an insecurity about that. It's like, they've kind of isolated themselves, and then they have to feel, and then if they feel like other people around them don't accept it, then it's like, oh, well, I'm the enlightened one and you're not. But what they don't realize too, because we're talking about projection, is that they are actually, and those people who they see as disbelievers or as or people who are evil, they're not realizing that they're looking in a mirror. They're looking at an aspect of themselves. And that doesn't mean that the person's evil, but they're looking at an aspect of themselves that they are terrified of. Maybe they don't need to. See, that's why I always work on shadow integration. And I'm, like I said, I have a tantric point of view, which is that in tantra, I don't mean it in the sex way. I mean it in the way of, weaving things together. All our life experiences are part of who we are. And that's where we need to go. The Tantra is about the weaving. And so everything that happens to you, good and bad, and even your sensual pleasures, all of that is part of who you are. It's part of your life experience, and you don't want to reject, obviously we have what they call, in Buddhism, there's Manjushri, who has the short sort of discrimination, right? And we say discrimination, we don't mean this in like a racial sense or gender sense or anything like that. Discrimination in the sense of I can discern between what's right in this situation and what's not right, or what is right action or correct action in a particular situation, rather than having this very black and white view of what's moral and what's not moral. Okay, you notice the morality card will come up a lot in this deck. And that's literally what that's why it will say drop your morals. It's not saying that you need to be an awful, terrible person. It means that drop the sense of morality, that sense of shame that we carry around. But these breakdowns, kind of circling back to where I had started with this, it's that, sometimes the idea is that it's trying to break down those ideas in you. It's trying to get you to look at something differently. So, I didn't expect to kind of move into the religious studies thing, but I never know where these are going to go in the morning. So let's do our card pull for today. We're already at 7:05. This is funny. All right. So our first card is the turning in card, okay? So, and we've had this card before. This is the woman meditating, and she's got all these, look like these ghost-like figures, like, screaming at her. But she's not, they're more like smoke and mirrors. It's like she doesn't really hear them, okay? Because she's turned in and is listening to her own inner voice and not listening to the noise of people around her, okay? Now, the inner feeling, this is literally what I was just talking about with the good-evil thing. They call this the schizophrenia card, but what this is the idea that you are split. That you, in this case, they're talking about the split between the head and the heart. that you are caught between what is the rational, sensible, analytical thing to do and what is my heart telling me to do. Okay? It's like being stuck between those two things. And oftentimes we don't trust what our heart tells us because, that's the other side of it. It may not be the religious side of it. I mean, it could be part of the morals that we are raised with, but it could also be just the social ideas about what it means to be a good worker bee in society kind of thing, or what it means to be, a good partner, or what it means to be a good, whatever it is. There's the idea that we have this split between what's right and what's wrong, and that's very, very clearly defined, and that you can't deviate from that, when the reality is that it's not usually that black and white. There may be, people might always be able to come up with some extreme examples, like in ethics classes and stuff, but this is not so much about, this is about being more flexible on that point. And also understanding that people will do things and think, based on, this is why sometimes too, even when people do things to us, we have to look at it and say, okay, what is that person struggling with, right? What are they struggling with? And, is it that they're being misunderstood? And the question is, if I was in whatever state that they're going through or whatever crisis they're going through, and I maybe acted out in a way that people didn't like, would I want people to understand me? That's where the whole basis of forgiveness really comes from. It's the idea that recognizing that, people may screw up and some people just chronically are narcissistic and treat people bad. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but sometimes you have to look at saying like, okay, what's that person, what's the inner thing that they're dealing with that they are absolutely torturing themselves with. And again, that doesn't always mean, by the way, that, you just let everything go that people do, but recognizing that sometimes when you have somebody who's normally one way and then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe they don't talk to people for a while or they don't do things like you have to recognize that person may be going through their own process and that may be part of what they're doing, just as you might go through that process yourself. Yeah, and the external feeling of which we're aware is isolation. So I think kind of getting back to that theme is like when we have these moments of breakdown, it's the idea that I think when we choose a different path or choose to do something different, then we feel that we're going to be isolated from other people, that people are not going to accept us, they're not going to accept what we're doing. You're going to get people who are going to criticize, that's why you don't want to listen to these voices, right? But it reminds me of in the King Arthur legends, one of the things that all the Knights of the Round Table have to do is eventually they all decide that when they go on their quests, they all have to go in a separate direction and they cannot take a road that's already been traveled. And that's kind of the idea of questing. And of course, they're questing for the Grail. And what's the Grail? The Grail is that ultimate kind of, authenticity of self, at least in one sense, right? So now we have the transformation card. Okay, this is the death card in the traditional deck, but it's a very beautiful card. And it's the idea that this is all about transformation. And the thing is, because we're transforming into something we haven't been before, we don't really know what that is. We don't necessarily know what that's going to look like. And that's the scary part. We don't know, and we're not necessarily always willing to trust. But ultimately, our outcome card is the sharing card. This is the Queen of Wands. And so this is the idea of saying, I think it's more about being able to kind of be out in the world and sharing our gifts and sharing what we have. Like that's the thing. That's the thing that we're trying to transform into, is the person who has the abundance and can share that abundance with everybody else, because the reality is that you're part of the system. People who say, well, I earned mine and it's all mine, and I'm not suggesting too that people have to like give all their money away or anything like that. But what it means is more that the gifts that you have are things that are best shared with others. I think there was a thing in the Zohar, which is a Kabbalistic text from like the 12th century, where there was a story of an angel who showed a rabbi heaven and showed them hell. And when they went to heaven first, they saw all these people sitting around a big banquet. There was plenty of food, but everybody had spoons, the utensils chained to their wrists. And what they would do is they would take the spoons and they would feed each other with them. That's so they were able to participate in the banquet because they were able to feed each other. And when he went to hell, it was exactly the same scenario, only because the people were more focused on, yeah, your fave story, because they're focused on themselves, they couldn't do it, so they were starving because they weren't actually reaching out to anybody else. So that to me is kind of the element of sharing here, is the idea of, it's you know, it's not just us. I mean, we are as part of the system, and when we feel isolated, sometimes it's good to try to remember the system that we're part of and the support that we have, and also to recognize that when we're going through periods of transformation, sometimes this means that it's because we are not taking a beaten path, and that can be scarier. But the answer to this conundrum is, they say, just let go of both at once. You don't want to. You need to go with whatever your inner authority is. You know. So, and again, like I said, if you've done your human design, even if you don't necessarily want to do it with me, if you haven't done it. You can go on, I think it's jovianarchive.com. You can always, put your birth date, time, place information in, and at the very least, it'll show you what your type is and what your inner authority is. So I mean, that at least that piece of information can tell you about yourself energetically. So so that I think it's just this idea about the only way to solve the split is to recognize that basically that. It's almost like the Maya idea, things aren't necessarily really split. Rather than thinking of ourselves as kind of isolated and having to figure it all out on our own. I think at least part of the thing that when we have these breakdowns in the routines that we have, it's trying to show us how we're connected to other people, or maybe where we need to reach out and collaborate with other people, or even if we're just kind of still doing something on our own, how we're sharing that with other people, or how we're, how we're sharing at least the gifts and talents, whatever they are, because they're different for everybody. And the fact that one person has one talent and you don't doesn't necessarily make them better than you. It's just they do and know something different from you, and they're both things that are obviously needed. One last Alan Wattsism before I go. Because he was talking about going to a philosophy and science conference where they were talking about genetics, and they're saying we can breed any kind of human. So we want to ask you philosophers, what's the best kind of human that we can breed? And Alan Watts is like, well, you really want to be careful about doing that. He said, because, you need all kinds of people depending on the situation. He says, you start doing that, he says, and you're going to have a plague of saints. Like, people were laughing, but it is. It's like a plague, It's a plague of saints. You got to be careful about that kind of stuff, because that goes back to his lecture on why you cannot improve yourself. But because you don't actually know what you're getting to, and you don't necessarily know the way, so you have to trust the bigger system. I'm just pulling the last essential oil card. We have cinnamon oil card today, and the keyword is intimacy. The trigger statement is, this is too good to be true. The true statement is, it can only get better. Allow yourself to experience more joy and love. Raise your resonance by swimming in the sweetness of life. Yeah. So I think fundamentally too, at the end of the day, whatever we're doing, we want to enjoy life. We want to love life. And that's often, it's a great thing. That's a great goal, but it's often one that's very hard, because we always somehow feel like we're bad for enjoying ourselves. But anyway, that's probably a different live stream. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. This is, this kind of, I literally came on thinking, do I have enough to talk about here? And of course, I don't know, it always seems to work out. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I will be here again tomorrow morning, same time. And of course, if you didn't see this whole thing, the recording will be on Instagram. And then of course, I'll put it on YouTube later today. Have a great rest of your morning, and we'll see you tomorrow.